He walked into the lavish wedding reception, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening. But then, his eyes fell on her, his ex-wife, laughing with the twins, as they hung up decorations. It wasn't just any reunion, it was his own wedding. And there they were, an image that didn't quite fit. What was really going on? Why were they here, together, and how had they gotten so close? If this story stirs something in you, take a moment to like, subscribe, or share. Your support means the world, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter. Ethan Carter stood at the threshold of the grand ballroom, the soft hum of voices and laughter seeping through the heavy wooden doors. The world outside was gray with an early winter chill, but here, inside the building, the air was warm and thick with the scent of roses and vanilla candles, a far cry from the raw winds of his past that still lingered in his memory. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, trying to steady himself before he entered, before he saw her again. His wedding reception, his second, to a woman who was everything his first marriage had lacked, was meant to be the celebration of new beginnings. Yet standing here, looking into the ballroom, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the life he had left behind. Ethan had imagined this moment for months, entering his new life with grace and dignity. He was surrounded by strangers, acquaintances of his fiancée, people who would only ever know him as the man who had built a future for himself after a painful past. But the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach wouldn't leave him. The life he had walked away from, the family he had once known, felt as present here as the scent of the roses filling the air. His eyes searched the room, moving past the tables of guests, past the extravagant arrangements and fine linens until they fell upon her, Maria Bennett, his ex-wife. She stood near the entrance, dressed in a modest but elegant dark blue gown, adjusting one of the table settings. For a brief moment, she looked like she was still the woman he once knew, the woman who had held his heart in her hands, fragile and trusting, before everything had fallen apart. The woman who had walked away from him, not with hate, but with resignation. She was surrounded by their children, twins now, growing up too fast. Noah, with his brown curls, was twisting the ribbon on a centerpiece, while Sophia, more reserved, was focused on the candles, straightening them carefully. Ethan's breath caught. He didn't expect the wave of emotion that hit him like a brick wall. It wasn't love or yearning. It was the harsh reality of seeing them, of seeing the life he had lost. His heart tightened, not in warmth, but in grief. And the grief wasn't just for what had been. It was for what could never be again. Maria's gaze lifted from the table, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. In that instant, the years between them seemed to collapse, and Ethan felt the pull of everything that was once his. But it wasn't a pull that drew him in. It was a weight that made him hesitate, unsure of how to approach her after everything that had happened. She stood frozen for just a second, and then, almost imperceptibly, she looked away, as if she had made a decision in that moment. She didn't want to speak to him, not here, not in front of anyone. Her voice, once so familiar, now seemed like a distant echo. He took a step forward, instinctively reaching for the past, for some kind of closure, but before he could move any further, Maria quickly turned and ushered Noah and Sophia away. She didn't look back. The children followed her, but Noah glanced at Ethan for a split second, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Then, just as quickly, Maria placed herself between them and led them into the crowd of guests, blending in with the sea of faces. Ethan stood there, rooted to the spot, his feet heavy as though they had been planted in concrete. The ballroom around him spun, the noise of chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of the string quartet seemed distant, far away. His world, for that moment, shrank down to the empty space where Maria and their children had been. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to explain it, but the void that opened up inside him was suffocating. He was supposed to be here, moving forward with his new life. But instead, he was stuck in the past he had abandoned, or perhaps the past that had abandoned him. His chest tightened as he watched them walk further into the crowd, their faces now distant and lost in the noise. He couldn't hear their voices, but he could picture the sound of Maria's gentle laughter, the easy way Noah and Sophia would ask her questions, looking up at her as if she was the sun, the center of their world, a world he had been pushed out of. And here he was, an outsider at his own celebration, searching for answers that he wasn't sure he deserved. The weight of years of separation, of regret, of questions that had no answers, pressed down on him like a stone lodged deep in his chest. He had come here today, thinking he could finally move forward, to step into a new life, a new beginning. But instead, he had been reminded of the life he could never fully reclaim. As he stood there, his fingers curling into the palms of his hands, he felt the tension between what was and what could have been. He had built his future, but it felt as if the past was still holding him hostage. He couldn't help but wonder if he would ever truly escape it. The voices around him continued, but all he could focus on was Maria, his ex-wife, the mother of his children, the woman who had once loved him, but she had moved on, and so had he, or so he had tried to. Yet, in the midst of this grand celebration, he was painfully aware that the past was never as far behind as he wanted to believe. And just as quickly as she had vanished into the crowd, his future seemed to disappear with her. Ethan Carter's footsteps echoed in the empty streets of Springfield as he walked aimlessly, the crisp autumn air biting at his face. His mind replayed the image of Maria and the twins, Noah and Sophia, over and over again, the way they had looked at him at the wedding reception, the way they had disappeared into the crowd. They hadn't even said a word. It was as though they had never been a part of his life at all. His chest tightened as the questions started to gnaw at him. Why hadn't they told him they were back in town? Why hadn't Maria reached out to him? He tried to push the thoughts away. After all, this was supposed to be the beginning of his new life. He had moved on, hadn't he? The engagement to Olivia, the excitement of the future they were about to build together, should have been enough to fill the empty spaces. Yet the more he walked through the streets of his old town, the more restless he became. Every corner, every shop, every familiar landmark seemed to bring back memories of the life he had once lived, a life that was no longer his, a life that felt both distant and unreachable. It was in the quiet of a small park, tucked away in a corner of Springfield, that Ethan finally saw them again. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted them, Noah and Sophia, laughing and playing in the distance, their small figures darting between the trees. His pulse quickened, his feet moving toward them before he even realized it. He wanted to shout their names, to close the distance between them and make up for all the lost years. But before he could reach them, the twins disappeared behind a large oak tree. The park suddenly felt too silent, too still. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Had he really seen them? Or was it just his mind playing tricks on him? He scanned the area frantically, hoping to catch another glimpse, but the park remained empty. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, disbelief creeping into his thoughts. The sudden wave of confusion and helplessness hit him harder than he expected. He had been so sure he was on the right path, so certain that his search for answers would lead him to closure. But now, standing alone in the park, he was more lost than ever. That's when he saw her, a woman, standing at the edge of the trees, her gaze locked on the spot where the children had just been. She was watching them, or rather, watching for them. Ethan couldn't see her face clearly from where he stood, but her posture was stiff, almost defensive. He took a step closer, hoping to make sense of the situation, to understand who she was and why she seemed so intent on keeping an eye on the twins. As he moved forward, the woman shifted her weight and turned her head slightly, just enough for Ethan to catch a glimpse of her expression. She wasn't surprised to see him. Instead, there was a coldness in her eyes, as though she had been expecting someone like him to appear. The distance between them seemed to stretch, like an invisible wall that Ethan couldn't quite breach. His heart sank. Every instinct told him that this woman was important, that she knew something about Maria and the children, something he needed to understand. But she wasn't ready to talk. He could feel it in the air around them, thick with hesitation and hidden truths. Ethan stepped forward again. But this time, the woman took a step back. her eyes narrowing as though she were guarding a secret too precious to share. Ethan's pulse quickened, and he felt a surge of frustration building inside him. He had come so close. He had seen his children, even if just for a moment. And now, this woman was the only lead he had. But instead of answers, all he had was more questions. "What do you know?" he asked, his voice more demanding than he intended. He didn't mean to sound harsh, but the desperation in his voice was undeniable. He had to know where Maria was. He had to understand why they had disappeared without a trace. The woman's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned and began to walk away. Ethan's heart dropped. He couldn't let her go. Not now. He took a step forward, reaching out as though he could stop her with a simple word, a simple gesture. But she didn't stop. She didn't even turn back. With one last look over her shoulder, she vanished into the trees, her figure swallowed by the shadows of the park. Ethan stood still, his mind racing. He had thought he was on the verge of something, a breakthrough, but now he was back at square one. The woman had given him nothing, no answers, no clues, only the weight of silence. He turned around and walked back toward the entrance of the park, the noise of the city surrounding him again, but it felt distant. The search for Maria was becoming more desperate, and with each passing moment, the truth seemed further out of reach. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He had to find Maria. He had to find his children. The sound of the bell echoed through the small florist shop as Ethan stepped inside, the familiar scent of fresh flowers filling his senses. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the calmness of the shop offering him a brief respite from the chaos swirling in his mind. He had been searching for hours, driving through the streets of Springfield and Greenfield, hoping for any sign of Maria or the children, but each turn had brought him more uncertainty. He felt like a man lost in a labyrinth of his own making, each twist and turn leading him further away from the truth. The florist behind the counter looked up, her soft, kind eyes meeting his. She was an older woman, her silver hair tied in a neat bun, wearing a light floral dress that matched the delicate atmosphere of the shop. She smiled at him, sensing his unease. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. But then, the image of Maria and the children flashed in his mind again, and he steadied himself. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice tight. "Maria Bennett. She used to live here, in Greenfield. I'm trying to find her." The woman's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "Maria? Yes. She's been in town for some time now." Her voice dropped slightly, as if she were careful not to speak too loudly. "She's attending a women's group here in Greenfield. They meet regularly at the community center." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Maria was here, in Greenfield. He hadn't been wrong in following his instincts, in coming to this small town that seemed to hold so many unanswered questions. But at the same time, a new wave of anxiety washed over him. What had kept her hidden all this time? Why hadn't she contacted him? The florist smiled kindly and reached for a small stack of flyers on the counter. She handed one to Ethan, the bold text on the front reading, "Healing and Hope Women's Empowerment." He took it, his fingers trembling slightly as he grasped the paper, his pulse quickening. "Maria comes here for support," the florist continued, her voice quiet. "She's been through a lot, like many others in the group. I'm sure they can help you understand more, if you want to know." Ethan looked down at the flyer in his hand, the weight of the words sinking in. It wasn't just a simple group. It was a place for healing, for women who had been hurt, who were trying to rebuild their lives. He could feel his breath catch in his chest. Had Maria been hurting all this time? Had she been trying to build a new life for herself and the children? Without him, he quickly thanked the florist, his mind already racing with thoughts of where to go next. As he stepped back out into the crisp air, he realized that this was the lead he had been waiting for. He had to find the community center. He had to find Maria. But what would he say when he did? Would she even want to see him after everything that had happened? The drive to Greenfield felt long, even though it was only a short distance away. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories of his time with Maria, the mistakes he had made, the hurt he had caused. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, willing himself to focus. He couldn't afford to lose track now. This was his chance. As he approached Greenfield, he slowed his pace, scanning the streets for any sign of the community center. He couldn't help but feel the weight of his past pressing down on him. Every street corner felt like a reminder of something he had lost. But today was different. He was here to fix things, to find the answers he had been searching for. Ethan finally spotted the small, nondescript building near the center of town, the community center. It was quieter here, away from the bustle of Springfield, the kind of place where people came to heal, to escape the noise of the outside world. He parked the car and sat for a moment, his hands still gripping the wheel. He wasn't sure what he was going to find, but he couldn't turn back now. He stepped out of the car and made his way toward the door, taking a deep breath. Just as he reached the entrance, he noticed a small local shop across the street. Curiosity tugged at him, and he crossed the road to take a look. The shop was a quaint little place, filled with handmade crafts and old furniture. He paused outside, peering through the window, and then he saw them, Noah, Sophia, the twins. They were standing inside the shop, looking at a display of old toys. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the world around him went silent. He could see them clearly now, their faces just as he remembered Noah, with his bright eyes and unruly brown hair, and Sophia, so quiet, so reserved, but with the same unmistakable look of innocence. He stepped forward, his heart racing as he neared the door. He had to talk to them, had to make sure they knew he was here, that he was looking for them, for Maria. But as he reached for the door, a woman stepped into his path. Her presence was sudden and unexpected, and she looked at him with a cold, watchful gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply moved between Ethan and the twins, as if protecting them from something, from him. Ethan stood there for a moment, frozen in place. His mind raced, trying to piece together who this woman was and why she had come between him and his children. Was she a relative, a caretaker? His pulse quickened, and his thoughts began to cloud with confusion. The woman glanced at him once more, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. She said nothing, but the message was clear. He wasn't welcome here. Ethan's chest tightened. He needed answers, but they were slipping away from him, just out of reach. He had come so close. And now, with the woman standing in front of him, he felt more lost than ever. He stepped back, his mind swirling. Who was this woman, and why was she standing in the way of him and his children? Ethan stepped into the small, dimly lit shop, the air thick with the scent of old books and wood polish. It was a place he had passed countless times, but had never entered. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he made his way toward the counter. His thoughts were a whirlwind. He had followed the lead, hoping to find Maria or some clue about her whereabouts. But instead, he had stumbled into something much more unexpected. The woman standing behind the counter caught his eye before he could even make his way inside. Rebecca Hunt, his ex-fiancée. Ethan froze, his body going rigid as the familiar figure met his gaze. She hadn't changed much in the years since their brief but intense relationship had ended, her hair still dark and sharp, her features still set in a serious, calculating expression. The same Rebecca he remembered, but now standing in front of him in a shop, her presence as unexpected as a ghost from the past. The last time he had seen her was years ago, before his marriage to Maria had fallen apart. Yet, here she was, in Greenfield, as if fate had conspired to bring them face to face again. Rebecca. His voice was quiet, unsure, as if he wasn't entirely certain this was real. She seemed taken aback at first, her eyes flickering with a mix of recognition and something he couldn't quite read. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice cool, measured. "It's been a long time." Ethan stood there for a moment, his mind trying to piece things together. What was she doing here, in a town that was so far removed from their shared past? Why was she involved with Maria and the twins? The shop was nearly empty. save for a few shelves lined with forgotten trinkets. Rebecca moved behind the counter, reaching for a cup of tea. Her motions were deliberate, almost defensive, as if she had rehearsed them 1,000 times in her head. "What brings you to Greenfield?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "I'm looking for Maria," Ethan said, stepping closer. "I thought maybe you could help me find her." Rebecca's gaze shifted away from him for just a second, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I don't know where she is," she said, but the words felt off, as though she were hiding something. Ethan's patience was wearing thin. The woman standing in front of him had been part of his life once. They had shared dreams, plans, and even a future that now seemed far out of reach. Yet here she was, and instead of offering help, she was shutting him out. Something about this wasn't adding up. "You're lying," Ethan said, his voice sharp now. "You've been keeping tabs on Maria, haven't you? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you just come forward?" Rebecca's eyes flickered with something a flash of guilt, perhaps, or regret. She sighed, setting the cup down slowly. "Maria reached out to me after the divorce," she said, her voice low. "She didn't know who else to turn to. She was alone, with 2 young children to raise, and she needed someone. I wasn't the first person she called, but I was the only one who answered." Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The world tilted on its axis, and for a moment, he had to steady himself, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Maria had reached out to Rebecca, his ex-fiancée, after their marriage had ended. The very same woman who had been so important to him, the one he had walked away from, was now a part of his children's life in ways he had never anticipated. Rebecca continued, her voice softer now, tinged with something like sadness. "I've been helping Maria with the twins. They've grown so much, but they're still just kids. And Maria, she wasn't ready to let you back in. She didn't want to drag you into this, not after everything that happened." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. He felt a wave of anger and confusion flood over him. But there was something else, too, something sharper, more painful, a deep, gnawing regret. He hadn't realized it at the time, but Maria had been carrying all of this on her own, and he had never even known. She had kept him at arm's length, not out of spite, but out of a need to protect the children from the very man who had once been their father. "You never thought to tell me any of this." Ethan's voice was rising now, disbelief in every syllable. "Maria never thought I deserved to know about my own kids." Rebecca shook her head, her eyes avoiding his. "It wasn't my place to say anything. Ethan, you have to understand. Maria was in pain. She wasn't the same person after everything went down." Ethan's mind was racing, trying to connect the dots, to make sense of the words that had just been spoken. His past, his relationship with Maria, his estranged children. It was all falling apart, and in its place was a version of reality that he hadn't been prepared for. Rebecca took a step closer to him now, her face softening, as though she could sense the storm brewing inside him. "You can't just walk in and expect everything to be okay. Ethan, you can't undo the years that have passed." Before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Carter." Ethan turned around sharply. There, standing at the back of the shop, was Noah. The boy was staring at him with wide eyes, his gaze filled with confusion and curiosity, but it was only for a brief moment. Before Ethan could say a word, a woman appeared beside Noah. She moved quickly, her hand on his shoulder, guiding him away from the counter. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was her, the woman who had been watching him from the corner of the store. She stood there now, her eyes hard, and in one swift motion, she stepped between him and Noah. Rebecca's gaze darted nervously from Ethan to the woman. The tension in the air grew thick, the unspoken words hanging like a storm cloud ready to burst. "Who is she?" Ethan demanded, his voice hoarse with emotion. Rebecca's response was barely a whisper. "Someone who's been taking care of them." Ethan took a step forward, but the woman's presence was a wall he couldn't get past. She gave him no chance to speak, no room for understanding. And just like that, Noah and the woman were gone, leaving Ethan standing in the middle of the store, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. Ethan walked slowly down the quiet streets of Greenfield, the weight of the past pressing on his chest with each step. The news from Rebecca still echoed in his mind, every word she had spoken sinking deeper into his consciousness. Maria had reached out to Rebecca after their divorce, after everything that had happened. Maria had trusted Rebecca with her children, had confided in her when she didn't know where else to turn. Ethan's steps faltered. For so long, he had blamed Maria for keeping him out of their children's lives, for not giving him the chance to be a part of their world again. But now, standing in the cold, with the wind biting at his face, Ethan felt something more painful than regret. He had never really understood, not fully, what Maria had been through, the struggles she had faced in silence, the weight of raising their children alone, with no one by her side, with the constant fear of not being good enough, of failing them. Ethan had been so focused on his own grief and frustration that he never stopped to consider what Maria was enduring. And now, the truth was so much harder to swallow. His chest tightened as he replayed the conversation in his mind. Rebecca's words echoed through his thoughts like an endless loop. Maria hadn't been keeping the children from him because she hated him. She had been keeping them away because she was afraid that he would leave again, that he would disappear, like he had before. Maria had feared that, just like their marriage, she would have to carry the burden of their family alone once more. Ethan's feet carried him forward as his mind worked overtime. How many times had he blamed her for shutting him out, for keeping him at arm's length? How many nights had he spent resenting her for keeping their children from him, when the truth was that she had been trying to protect them? He had failed her. He had failed them. His anger had blinded him to the complexity of the situation. It wasn't just about him being a father. It was about him being a partner, about understanding the sacrifice Maria had made to keep their children safe. The sadness that had settled in his chest was overwhelming. His mistakes seemed too large to fix. How could he make up for the years he had lost with Noah and Sophia? How could he ever repair the damage he had done to his family when his own actions had pushed them away? As Ethan walked through Greenfield's peaceful streets, he found himself standing outside a small cafe. He hadn't realized how long he had been walking or how much time had passed. The cold air nipped at his skin, reminding him of the harsh reality that there was no escaping the past. He pushed the door open, the bell above it ringing softly as he stepped inside. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around him like a blanket, but the feeling was fleeting. His mind was still racing, still stuck in the web of his own guilt and the tangled emotions that came with it. He sat down at a small table by the window, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his coffee cup. The small cafe was quiet, a far cry from the noise and confusion that had filled his life for so long. He needed a moment to clear his thoughts, to process everything he had just learned, but his mind refused to calm. He could still hear Rebecca's voice in his ears, still see the way she had looked at him with those sad, knowing eyes. Just as he began to zone out, lost in the spiral of his own emotions, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. An unknown number. His heart skipped a beat. It could be Maria. He didn't know if he was ready for this, but he answered the call anyway, unable to resist. Ethan. Maria's voice was quiet on the other end, as though she were trying to find the right words. It made his heart ache. Maria. His voice was shaky, filled with emotions he couldn't quite control. Is everything okay? Where are you? I think it's time we talk, Maria said softly. The words hung in the air between them, her voice carrying an emotion he couldn't quite place. It was both an invitation and a challenge. She wasn't angry, she wasn't accusing, but he could feel the weight of her silence, the distance between them that had grown too wide over the years. The sound of her voice, familiar, yet distant, sent a flood of memories rushing back. Ethan's thoughts jumbled together. How many times had he tried to call her, tried to reach out to the woman he had loved, only to be met with silence? And now, here she was, calling him, the woman who had held his heart, the woman who had carried their children all these years, was asking him to meet her. His mind was still spinning, but something about her voice, something about the way she spoke to him, made him believe that this was the moment when everything could change. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll send you the address," she replied. "But Ethan, I need you to understand. This isn't about the past. This is about now. This is about us and the future we never gave ourselves a chance to build." Her words were heavy, each one settling like a stone in his chest. Ethan had spent so many years running from the past, so many years blaming Maria, blaming himself. But now he had the chance to do something about it, to stop running, to face the truth and maybe, just maybe, build a future that was more than just a broken dream. He ended the call and sat there for a moment, his mind in turmoil. He wasn't sure what to expect, wasn't sure what kind of conversation lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, a chance, a possibility. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead as he walked to the door. The cold air hit him again, but it wasn't as harsh as before. He had been given an opportunity to make things right. He wasn't sure how, but he would find a way. As he stepped out into the street, his phone buzzed again. He looked down at the screen, seeing the address Maria had sent him. He didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what he had to do. The diner was quiet, save for the occasional clink of silverware against ceramic plates and the low murmur of a conversation between the waitress and the cook. The flickering neon lights outside cast an eerie glow through the window, illuminating the form of Maria as she sat across from Ethan, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, like a storm ready to break. Ethan watched her carefully, his gaze tracing the lines that had deepened in her face since the last time he had seen her. Maria was no longer the young woman he had married, full of energy and hope. Life had worn her down, years of raising twins alone, of carrying the weight of a family on her shoulders. But even now, there was still something familiar in the way she held herself, something that made his chest ache with regret. He had loved her once, deeply, but now he could see how much had changed. How much she had changed. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Maria lowered her gaze, as if she could no longer meet him head-on. Ethan felt his stomach tighten, the same fear and uncertainty that had plagued him for years, creeping back into his mind. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, this conversation, this confrontation, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of sitting in front of her, face to face, after all this time. "I didn't expect you to come here," Maria said softly, her voice almost lost in the hum of the diner. She didn't look at him when she spoke, as if afraid of what her eyes might reveal. "I didn't think you'd want to." Ethan's pulse quickened. "I need to know the truth. Maria, I need to understand. Why didn't you ever tell me about the twins? Why did you shut me out?" His words came out sharper than he intended, but the anger and confusion he had carried for years were finally bubbling to the surface. Maria's fingers trembled as she set her coffee cup down. She took a deep breath, as if trying to steady herself. "I didn't want you to hate me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want you to think that I kept the twins from you on purpose. But after everything that happened, after you left, I didn't know how to let you back in." She paused, her eyes clouded with emotion. "I was afraid." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of silence. Ethan leaned forward, his chest tight. "Afraid of what?" he asked, his voice low. "Afraid that you would leave us again," Maria whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, "that I would be left to pick up the pieces once more. So I chose to protect the twins. I thought it was better if they didn't know about you, if they didn't know what had happened between us. I didn't want them to grow up thinking their father didn't care." The confession hit Ethan like a slap. He felt the air in the room thicken as the truth sank in. Maria had been carrying that fear all along, a fear that he would abandon her and their children again. And in trying to protect them, She had built walls that had only grown taller over the years, pushing him further away. I didn't want to be the one to tell them that their father didn't care. Maria continued, her voice cracking as the tears finally spilled over. I didn't want them to hate you, so I kept you out. I kept them from you. Ethan's heart ached as he listened to her words. The pain she had carried, the burden she had borne alone, it was more than he had ever imagined. And in his anger and frustration, he had never taken the time to understand her. He had been so focused on his own hurt, on the bitterness of their broken marriage, that he had never considered what Maria had gone through. His hand clenched into a fist on the table, his chest tightening as he struggled to hold back his own emotions. He had failed her. He had failed their children, all these years. He had blamed her for everything, convinced that she had kept him away. But now, the truth was clear. She had done it to protect them, to shield them from the hurt he had caused. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to apologize for the years of silence, for the damage he had done, for the family he had abandoned. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took another shaky breath. I never wanted to be the villain in this story. Ethan, she said, her voice barely audible. I never wanted you to think that I was trying to keep you out. But I was afraid that if I let you in again, you would leave. And I couldn't risk that. I couldn't risk hurting them again. Ethan's heart ached as he listened to her. She wasn't blaming him. She wasn't accusing him. She was simply explaining why she had done what she did, why she had made the choices she had made. And in that moment, Ethan realized how deeply he had misunderstood her. He reached across the table, his hand trembling as he placed it over hers. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. Maria, I never understood. I was so angry and I couldn't see it. I couldn't see what you were going through. Maria looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something hope. Maybe, or just the comfort of knowing that he truly understood now. For a moment, there was silence between them. The years of hurt and misunderstandings seemed to hang in the air, but for the first time, there was also a flicker of something else. Maybe it was forgiveness. Maybe it was a chance for them to move forward, to rebuild the trust they had lost. But just as Ethan opened his mouth to speak again, Maria stood up abruptly, her face hardening with a sudden resolve. There's more you need to know, Ethan, she said, her voice steady but urgent. But not here, not now. Ethan stood up too, his heart racing. What more? What else do I need to know? Maria didn't answer him right away. She simply turned and walked toward the door, her back straight, her steps firm. Ethan followed her, his mind spinning with the questions that still lingered. He had just begun to understand the depth of Maria's pain, but now it seemed there was more to uncover. Maria reached the door and paused, her hand on the handle. Without looking back, she spoke over her shoulder. Meet me at the old house. Ethan, we need to talk, but it's not something I can say here. She didn't look back, but he knew something had changed. The hum of Ethan's office was louder than usual, the constant buzz of his phone and the soft tap of his keyboard filling the space. He sat at his desk, eyes glued to the screen of his computer as he sifted through the latest report from his public relations team. The situation was deteriorating, fast. Rebecca Hunt, his ex-fiancée, had done more than just keep an eye on him. She had launched a full-scale smear campaign. Ethan had known it was coming, but he hadn't prepared for how relentless it would be. She had a way of twisting the truth, of making it sound like she was doing the world a favor by exposing his flaws. And now, people were listening. They were hearing Rebecca's version of the story, a version where Ethan was the villain, the absent father, who had walked away from his family without a second thought. The media was only too happy to broadcast it, painting Ethan as the irresponsible, selfish man he had fought so hard not to be. The accusations against him were everywhere. He could see them in the headlines, Millionaire returns to a family. He abandoned, Ethan Carter's guilt-laden comeback, each one a punch to the gut. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with his hands as he tried to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. The weight of the words, the images, the clips of interviews with Maria's friends who had been swayed by Rebecca's narrative, it was all starting to feel suffocating. He had fought so long to rebuild his life, to move forward from the mistakes of his past. But now, it felt like he was drowning in a wave of public judgment. He wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for his reputation, his dignity. He had to clear his name, to show the world that he wasn't the man they thought he was. That he wasn't just the rich guy who had walked away. He wasn't the man who had abandoned his children. Ethan's mind raced, trying to think of a way to respond to the accusations, a way to undo the damage Rebecca had done. But every angle he considered seemed to come up short. What could he say? How could he explain the years of silence? How could he make the world understand the pain he had gone through, the reasons behind his absence? Just then, his phone buzzed, breaking through his thoughts. It was a message from his PR manager. Ethan picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. The message read, "The news is picking up steam. We need to prepare a statement for the media. The public perception is starting to turn against you." He sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. It was one thing to have people like Rebecca and Maria's friends cast judgment, but it was another thing entirely when the public started believing their version of events. And that was exactly what was happening. The media had latched onto Rebecca's narrative, and now they were spreading it like wildfire. A sinking feeling settled in Ethan's stomach. The truth didn't seem to matter anymore. It was all about the story that was being told, the one that painted him as the villain, the one that made it seem like he didn't care, like he hadn't tried. But how could he explain to people that it wasn't that simple, that things had been so much more complicated than they realized? Ethan took a deep breath, pushing his thoughts aside. He couldn't let this break him. He couldn't give up. He had come too far, fought too hard to let a smear campaign take everything away. But what could he do? His phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. He opened it quickly, his heart racing as he read the subject line, "Request for comment on recent accusations." The email came from a well-known reporter, someone who had been covering the story from the beginning. The message was short, almost curt. "We'd appreciate your comment on the recent accusations that have surfaced regarding your past actions. Would you like to give us a statement?" Ethan's hands shook as he stared at the screen. He could already hear the news anchor's voice in his head. Ethan Carter, a wealthy businessman, is being accused of abandoning his family. His ex-fiancée, Rebecca Hunt, has come forward to tell her side of the story, painting a picture of a man who was too selfish to care for his own children. The email felt like a blow to the stomach. Ethan hadn't been prepared for this kind of exposure. It was one thing to deal with the rumors from people who knew him personally, but it was another to have the entire world looking at him, judging him. His reputation was on the line, and there was no telling how deep the damage would go. He stood up from his desk, pacing around the room as he tried to make sense of everything. How could he explain his actions? How could he tell the truth when the world had already made up its mind? And then it hit him. He couldn't wait for the world to come to him. He had to take control of the narrative. He had to stand up and tell his side, not through reporters or press releases, but through his own words. He wasn't going to let Rebecca or anyone else dictate who he was or what he had done. Ethan grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and headed for the door. He wasn't going to let this break him. He would confront the situation head-on, speak the truth, and reclaim the story. As he walked out of the office, his phone buzzed one more time. This time, it was a notification from the news app. He opened it and saw the headline flash across the screen, "Ethan Carter speaks out." What's next for the millionaire father? He didn't know what was next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let the world write his story for him. The weight of everything, the media, the accusations, the years apart pressed down on Ethan as he walked slowly up the familiar path leading to his old family home. The ivy that once adorned the porch was now overgrown, wild in places, but it still looked like the place where he had once dreamed of a future with Maria. It felt like a lifetime ago. The steps seemed heavier now, each one carrying the weight of years of mistakes and regrets. He hadn't stepped foot in this house in over 5 years, But today, the past and present collided in a way that was too overwhelming to ignore. Maria had asked him to meet her here, just outside the house, away from the prying eyes of the world, away from the media frenzy. She hadn't told him what she wanted to say, only that it was time for them to speak again. Ethan had hoped, prayed, even that this would be the moment where everything could begin to heal. But as he stood there, waiting for her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be another test, another confrontation. The house looked the same, but it wasn't the place he remembered. It was colder now, more distant, like it had been shut off from the world for far too long. The familiar, comforting warmth that used to fill the house, especially when Maria was there, was gone. He could almost hear the echoes of their laughter, the sound of their conversations late at night. But those memories felt like ghosts now. What had happened to them? What had happened to their love? When Maria stepped outside, she was dressed simply, her expression unreadable. The years had changed her too. There were lines on her face that hadn't been there before, and her eyes, though still familiar, were guarded. The warmth in her features had been replaced by a kind of hardness, a wariness that spoke of everything she had been through alone. "Maria," Ethan said quietly, taking a step toward her, but she held up her hand, stopping him in his tracks. "You think you can just waltz back into our lives?" Maria's voice was sharp, the anger she had been holding on to for so long spilling out. She wasn't looking at him directly, but her body was tense, every inch of her bracing for something, anything that might come next. "You think that after all these years, you can just show up and make everything right again?" Ethan swallowed, the sting of her words landing deeper than he expected. He had come here, hoping for a breakthrough, but the walls between them seemed higher than ever. "I don't think I can make everything right," he replied, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I just think it's time we start somewhere. Maria, I've made mistakes. I know I can't undo them. But I'm here now. I want to be here for you, for the twins. I need you to know that I'm not here for some kind of redemption. I'm here because I finally figured out what matters. I want to fix what's been broken." Maria's eyes flickered with something. Was it doubt? Or maybe it was the trace of hope she had buried long ago. She didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there, her arms crossed as she took in his words. Ethan could see the conflict in her, the way she was fighting with herself, torn between the past and the possibility of something different. After a moment of silence, Maria spoke again, her voice softer but still cautious. "I need to know you're here for the right reasons. Ethan, for the twins, not for some kind of redemption arc. I need you to show me you're serious, that you can actually be the father they deserve." Ethan's heart clenched at the mention of the twins. He had spent years wondering if he would ever be given a chance to prove himself as a father. He had spent years regretting the fact that he wasn't there when they needed him the most. But now, standing in front of Maria, he knew that he couldn't let her down again. He had to show her and the children that he was committed, not just to them, but to his own transformation as a man. "I'll prove it to you," he said, the words coming from deep within him, filled with the sincerity he didn't even know he had left. "I'll prove it to both of you. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I'm here to stay. I'm not going anywhere." Maria didn't look at him. She was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the ground as if she were searching for the right words. Ethan waited, his breath caught in his chest. He had come here with the hope that she would be willing to let him in again. But he understood that it wasn't going to be that simple. They had been through too much for things to go back to the way they were before. Finally, Maria lifted her gaze to meet his. The expression in her eyes was softer now, though still tinged with doubt. "You still have a lot to prove, Ethan, but I'm willing to give you a chance, if you show me you're serious." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Ethan could hardly breathe as he processed what she had just said. This was his chance, the one he had been waiting for. He wasn't going to waste it. But before he could speak, Maria turned and began walking back toward the house, her steps deliberate, her back straight with determination. "Maria, wait," Ethan called after her, but she didn't turn around. "Not here," she said over her shoulder, her voice quieter now but still firm. "Meet me at the old house. Ethan, we need to talk, but not here." She didn't look back, but Ethan knew. Something had changed. The small cafe on the corner of Main Street had always been one of Ethan's favorite places in Greenfield. It was quiet, tucked away from the busy streets, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee had a way of calming his nerves. But today, the warm comfort of the space seemed to mock him, as if the walls themselves could sense the turmoil within him. He sat by the window, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him, but he didn't taste it. His mind was far away, lost in the conversation he had with Maria only a few days ago. The weight of her words still lingered in his chest, an unsettling mixture of guilt, longing, and regret. The days since their meeting had been full of unanswered questions. Every day, Ethan found himself more desperate to find Maria, to understand her struggles and to learn more about the life she had built without him. He couldn't shake the image of her face, the sorrow and fear she had hidden so well. But nothing had prepared him for what would come next. As he sat there, trying to clear his mind, the soft murmur of conversation from the table beside him drew his attention. Ethan wasn't one to eavesdrop, but the voices were too familiar. Two women were talking, their voices low but urgent. He recognized them immediately as Maria's old friends. He hadn't seen them in years, but their faces had once been a part of the life he thought he had left behind. He hadn't meant to listen, but their words caught him off guard. One of the women, Carla, was speaking now. Her tone laced with a quiet bitterness that made Ethan's stomach turn. "Ruined her father's business," Carla said, almost in a whisper, but Ethan could hear every word as if it was meant for him. You know, it wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. It was a betrayal. Ethan's family, his father, had a hand in it. They took everything from Maria and her dad. Ethan's pulse quickened. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information that had always felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. His hand tightened around his cup, the porcelain almost slipping from his grasp. He hadn't heard this before. Maria had never mentioned it, not in their arguments, not in their quiet moments when they'd tried to make sense of their fractured relationship. The other woman, Jenna, chimed in, her voice tinged with the same anger. She never said it, but I think that's why she kept the kids away from him. She thought he'd abandoned them, just like he abandoned her. It's all tied to that damn deal. And now Jenna paused, glancing around the cafe as if to make sure no one was listening. Now it's just too late to fix it. Ethan's head spun. He could feel the blood rush to his face, his hands beginning to tremble. The betrayal that Maria had felt, the anger and the heartbreak, he understood it all now, in a way he never had before. He had spent so many years blaming himself for not being there, but the truth was far more complicated. His family, his father had played a role in the suffering that Maria had endured. It wasn't just a matter of emotional neglect. It was financial destruction. And it was a part of the reason why Maria had kept their children from him. He hadn't known. He had been blind to it. His family's business dealings had torn apart the very foundation of the life Maria had built for herself and the twins, and he hadn't seen it. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, in his own failures, that he hadn't bothered to understand the full scope of what had happened. The guilt he had carried for years felt trivial now, dwarfed by the weight of this revelation. Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest, the kind that comes from realizing the depth of your own ignorance. How had he never known? How had he allowed himself to be so blind to the consequences of his family's actions? How could he have been so selfish, so wrapped up in his own guilt, that he failed to see the bigger picture? The answer felt like a heavy weight on his heart, pressing him into the very seat he sat in. He barely heard the rest of the conversation. The words were a blur, drowned out by the sound of his own thoughts, the racing questions that spun faster and faster in his mind. How had this all happened? How had Maria endured all of this on her own, without ever telling him the truth? The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Maria hadn't just been protecting the twins from him. She had been protecting herself from the past, from the pain of what had been taken from her, and from the man she once loved. Ethan had never fully understood what it meant to walk in her shoes, and now he saw just how much he had failed her. As he sat there, numb from the weight of what he had learned, his phone buzzed on the table. The sudden noise broke through the fog in his mind, and he reached for it, his hands shaking. It was an unknown number. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he hesitated before answering. "Hello, Ethan." Maria's voice came through the phone, soft but firm. "I think it's time we talk." The sound of her voice, so familiar and yet so distant, made his stomach tighten. It was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he hoped would come. He had always known they needed to talk, but he never imagined it would be under these circumstances. His mind raced, trying to process everything: the conversation, the revelation, the guilt, and he suddenly realized that he had to do something. He couldn't just sit back and let this moment slip away. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. Without another word, he ended the call, his fingers trembling as he placed the phone back down on the table. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy as he walked out of the cafe. The world outside seemed unchanged, the streets bustling with people, but to Ethan, everything had shifted. The world he had known was no longer the same. He didn't know what would happen when he got to Maria's house, but he knew one thing for certain: this conversation was going to change everything. Ethan rushed to his car, his mind set on one thing: getting the truth, no matter how hard it was to face. He had to see Maria, had to hear her side of the story, had to understand why things had turned out this way. But when he arrived at her house, something was different. The door was locked, the lights were off. There was no sign of Maria. His heart sank as he knocked on the door, the silence on the other side deafening. She wasn't there. As he stood there, his hands still on the door, the weight of everything he had learned hung heavy in the air. The truth was out there, but Maria had slipped away just out of reach. Ethan's eyes flickered to the street, his mind already racing. Where had she gone? Why had she left? And most importantly, what did this mean for them now? The sun was low in the sky when Ethan pulled up to the old warehouse, the familiar creaking of his car's door hinges echoing in the still air. The place hadn't changed much since the last time he'd been here, years ago when he and his father had walked through the rusted gates. Back then, the building had been full of life, buzzing with workers and activity, a hub of the business that had been his family's empire. Now, it stood silent and desolate, its broken windows reflecting the fading light in shards of glass. Ethan stared at the building for a long moment, trying to summon the strength to step inside. The air felt thick with history he had tried to escape from for so long. The ghosts of the past seemed to hang over him like a heavy cloak, but he knew this was the only place where he might find the answers he needed. The search for redemption had led him here. He had to know what had really happened between his family and Maria's, the terrible deal that had torn them apart. His footsteps echoed as he walked through the darkened hallways, the smell of mildew and dust overwhelming his senses. Every creak of the floorboards seemed like a reminder of the years that had passed, of the things that could never be fixed. The letter he had found in the cafe, the conversation he overheard it, had all pointed him here, to this very spot. And now, the moment of truth was finally here. He wandered deeper into the warehouse, his heart pounding with each step. His fingers brushed the cold, rusted surfaces of old machinery, as though touching the remnants of his family's past. The building was empty now, abandoned, but its walls held 1,000 secrets. Ethan wasn't sure what he was hoping to find. Maybe a trace of Maria's father's presence, maybe an explanation that would give him peace, or maybe he was hoping for something more, a reason to fix what had been broken. In the far corner of the warehouse, he spotted an old filing cabinet. The metal drawers were slightly ajar, as if someone had once rifled through them and never bothered to finish the job. His fingers fumbled with the drawer, pulling it open with a soft screech that seemed to disturb the quiet around him. He scanned the contents, a mixture of old invoices, contracts, and forgotten paperwork. Then, buried beneath the clutter, he saw something that caught his eye. A letter, its edges yellowed with age, was tucked into the back of the drawer. It was addressed to him, Ethan Carter. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the handwriting. It was Maria's father's. Without a second thought, Ethan pulled the letter from the drawer and unfolded it. His hands trembled as he read the words, each one hitting him harder than the last. Ethan, I'm writing this in the hope that you will one day understand the damage your family has caused. The deal your father made was not just a business transaction, it was a betrayal. It destroyed my life, my business, and everything I worked for. And it hurt my family. More than you could ever know. I know you didn't ask for this, but you were part of it. You have to live with that. Ethan's chest tightened as he read the words again. His father, his own flesh and blood, had been the one to ruin Maria's family. The weight of the revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent years carrying guilt for the collapse of his marriage, blaming himself for not being there. But the truth was far worse. His father's actions had devastated everything Maria had worked for, and he had been too blind to see it. He had been too busy chasing his own success to understand the consequences of the deals his family had made. I didn't know, Ethan muttered to himself, the words barely escaping his lips. I didn't know. He stared at the letter, the reality of it sinking in. All these years, he had thought that he was the one who had failed, that his own mistakes had torn his family apart. But now, he saw it all so clearly. His father's greed had been the catalyst for everything, and Maria had been the one to pay the price. The letter slipped from his fingers, falling to the floor like a symbol of everything that had been lost. Ethan's hands shook as he bent down to pick it up, feeling a deep ache in his chest. There was no undoing what had been done. The damage was irreversible. But one thing was clear now. He couldn't just walk away from this. Not anymore. I can't undo what's been done, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the emptiness of the warehouse. But I can start by making things right. The words felt hollow, as if they were too small to encompass the enormity of what he needed to do. But they were the only words he had, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a small spark that told him there was still a chance for redemption. He wasn't sure what that redemption would look like, or how he could ever make amends for the mistakes of the past, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to try. As he turned to leave the warehouse, his phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling as he looked at the screen. It was a text message from Maria. We need to talk. I'm at the park, alone. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had hoped for but hadn't dared to believe would come. Maria wanted to talk. She was willing to give him a chance. He didn't hesitate. He knew exactly where the park was. Without a second thought, he walked out of the warehouse. His mind focused on one thing: getting to the park, getting to Maria. He had no idea what would happen when they met, but he knew that it was the first step in trying to fix everything that had been broken. The drive to the park was a blur. Ethan's thoughts were scattered, racing from one question to the next. What would Maria say? Would she forgive him? Would she even listen to him after everything that had happened when he finally arrived at the park? His car screeched to a stop in front of the gate. The park was empty, save for a few stray dogs and joggers. But there, sitting on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, was Maria. Her back was straight, her posture tense, but she was there. She had come. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He stepped out of the car and walked toward her, each step feeling heavier than the last. His heart was in his throat as he approached the bench. But when Maria looked up at him, there was a softness in her eyes that he hadn't expected. I've waited a long time for this, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him. But now, in this moment, he was ready to listen. He was ready to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He sat down next to her, his heart racing. I'm here, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm here for the right reasons. I want to make things right. Maria. Her gaze held his for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. But in that silence, Ethan knew something had changed. It wasn't redemption. Not yet, but it was a start. Ethan stood at the entrance of the park, the weight of his past and present pressing against him with every step. His heart thudded louder than his footsteps as he approached the familiar bench where Maria sat, her form slightly hunched forward, eyes cast down, lost in thought. The afternoon sun bathed the scene in a golden glow, but it did nothing to ease the tension between them. The years that had passed since their last encounter felt like an ocean between them, vast and impassable. He took a deep breath and approached her cautiously, as though he might break something fragile by getting too close. Each step felt heavier than the last, but there was no turning back now. There had been too much left unsaid, too much to resolve. As he reached the bench, he paused, not knowing if words would be enough or if they would even be able to bridge the chasm of silence that had grown between them. When he sat down next to her, she didn't look up, her gaze still fixed on the ground. The stillness between them was suffocating, the air thick with unresolved anger, hurt, and regret. Ethan's eyes scanned the empty space between them, trying to find a way to begin. He had no rehearsed words, no script to follow. The only thing that mattered now was the truth, however painful it might be. Finally, it was Maria who broke the silence, her voice soft but unmistakable. "I know what you learned." "Ethan." She didn't turn her head toward him, but her words hung in the air, a declaration that shattered the fragile wall he had built around himself. "But it's not just about what happened with your father. It's about everything, the lies, the secrets we kept from each other." Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to speak so plainly, so openly, and yet he knew she had every right to. He had been the one to walk away, to leave her with nothing but the weight of his absence. He had been the one who had failed, not just her, but the children they had created together. Maria's eyes finally met his, but there was no softness in her gaze, no familiar warmth. It was a look that cut through him with the precision of a knife, a look that spoke of betrayal, pain, and the years spent in the silence of unspoken truths. Her voice quivered as she continued. "I kept them from you, Ethan, the twins. I didn't want them to know what kind of man their father really was." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, her eyes welled with unshed tears. I thought you had abandoned us, and I couldn't bear to watch them grow up knowing their father wasn't there for them." The words sliced through him. Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him had given way, as though the weight of everything he had failed to see, everything he had failed to understand, was suddenly bearing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words were tangled, caught in his throat. "I didn't know, Maria," he managed, his voice low and filled with regret. "I never wanted to leave. I didn't know. I didn't know what you were going through. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I just got my life together, I could come back. But I was wrong. I should have been there. I should have done better." Maria's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, but the pain in them remained. She looked away, her fingers trembling as she held on to the bench, as though trying to steady herself against the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "I know, Ethan," she whispered. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but the hurt was already there. It was already done. And when you left, it felt like the world had shattered. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix us." Ethan closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He had thought time could heal everything. He had thought that if he kept moving forward, if he kept his head down and worked hard enough, things would fall into place. But the truth was far harsher. Time hadn't healed anything. It had only deepened the wounds. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on hers. She didn't pull away, but her body remained tense. Ethan didn't know what he was asking for, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps understanding, but all he could do was offer her this small, tentative gesture of what he hoped could be a new beginning. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice cracking with the weight of those two simple words. "I'm sorry for everything, for not being there, for not seeing what you needed, for being so selfish." Maria's eyes met his again, and for a moment, Ethan saw a flicker of the woman he had once loved so deeply, the one who had been strong and hopeful, the one who had believed in their future together. But now that woman seemed so far away, swallowed by the years of pain and loss. "I never wanted you to leave, Ethan," Maria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her lips trembled, and Ethan could see the tears that threatened to spill. "But I had no choice. We both did what we thought was best. I thought I was protecting the kids. And you thought you were protecting yourself." The finality in her voice hit Ethan like a wave crashing against the rocks. The truth was undeniable. They had both made choices. They had both acted out of fear of loss, fear of the unknown, fear of facing the consequences of their decisions. Maria stood up abruptly, wiping her eyes quickly, as though to hide her vulnerability. The sharpness in her movements only deepened the tension that had settled between them. Ethan remained seated, watching her, waiting for her to say something more, something that would give him hope. But instead, she turned to face him, her face a mask of resolve. "I don't know if we can fix this." "Ethan," she said, her voice steady, though the emotion in her eyes betrayed her, "but I'm willing to give you a chance. You've got a lot to prove. But maybe, just maybe, we can start again. If you're serious." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Ethan felt a spark of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, or whether their shattered past could ever be repaired. But he knew one thing: he was ready to fight for it. To fight for her, for the twins, for a chance to rebuild what they had lost. As Maria walked away, her footsteps quick and decisive, Ethan sat on the bench, staring after her, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that whatever it was, he wasn't walking away this time. Ethan had spent too many nights tossing and turning, weighed down by the guilt of his past, by the shadows of his mistakes. He had allowed fear to keep him silent, to let the accusations and the media's portrayal of him as a villain shape his reality. But he couldn't keep running from his past anymore. He couldn't continue hiding behind the comfort of his wealth and status, pretending that everything would resolve itself on its own. He had to take responsibility not just for his actions, but for the future he wanted to create. The relentless media attention had only escalated over the past few weeks, each new headline painting him as an absent father, a failed partner, and someone who had abandoned his family when they needed him the most. Rebecca, who had once been his fiancée, had become one of the loudest voices in the campaign against him. She spoke of his irresponsibility, of how his family's business dealings had ruined hers, of how his sudden return was nothing more than a desperate attempt to redeem himself in the eyes of the public. But Ethan had reached his limit. He couldn't allow his past to dictate the future. He couldn't allow Rebecca's narrative, or anyone else's for that matter, to continue shaping his identity. If he wanted a chance with Maria, with the twins, if he wanted a future with them, he had to fight for it. It was time for him to speak up, not just to defend himself, but to apologize, to acknowledge his mistakes, and to show Maria that he was committed to doing better. The decision came suddenly, without warning, but Ethan knew in that moment that he couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't afford to hide in the shadows anymore. He had to face the public, face his past, and try to make amends. The next morning, Ethan called a press conference. He stood before the cameras, his mind racing but his body still, as he prepared to speak the words that would either lift the weight from his shoulders or crush whatever chance he had left. The room was filled with reporters, their cameras flashing as he stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edge, trying to steady himself. The silence in the room was deafening as Ethan cleared his throat. He glanced at the audience, his gaze briefly meeting the lens of the cameras before it returned to the floor. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He just needed to speak the truth, to own up to what he had done. "I made mistakes," he began, his voice steady but tinged with the raw emotion that had built up inside him for years. "I made choices that hurt the people I loved, and I've spent too much time hiding from them. But I'm here now, and I'm not running anymore." The words felt heavy on his tongue, But he pushed forward. The room was silent, everyone listening, hanging on to each word. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Ethan continued. "What I did in the past, I can't take back. But I'm here to tell you that I'm not the same man I was then. I've learned, and I'm willing to prove that I can be better for Maria, for the twins, and for myself." His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't stop. He wasn't just speaking to the cameras anymore. He was speaking to Maria, to the twins, to everyone who had doubted him. He was speaking to the part of himself that he had neglected for far too long. "I'm here to do better," Ethan said, his voice stronger now, unwavering. "I've hurt the people I love. I've failed them, but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I owe them that." The press conference ended in silence. Ethan didn't wait for the questions. He didn't need to hear the reporters' opinions. He had said what he needed to say. The rest was up to him and to Maria. As he walked away from the podium, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out, his hands still trembling. It was a message from Maria. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. "I'm willing to listen. Let's talk about how we can move forward." The weight on his chest eased slightly, but the relief was bittersweet. This was just the beginning. He had a long way to go before he could make up for the years he had lost. But Maria's willingness to listen, to even consider moving forward with him, was all he needed to keep going. Ethan walked out of the building, his mind still spinning, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He had taken the first step. He had publicly admitted his faults, and he had shown Maria that he was ready to fight for them. But as he walked through the parking lot, something caught his eye. At the far end, across the street, he spotted Noah and Sophia standing near a bench. They were looking in his direction, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity. Ethan's heart pounded as he saw the look in their eyes. They had been through so much too. He had to face them as well, to prove that he was serious about being the man they needed. He walked toward them, his steps slow, unsure of what to expect. The closer he got, the more uncertain he became. He didn't know if they would accept him, if they would ever forgive him. But he had no choice. If he wanted a future with Maria and the twins, he had to be brave enough to face it. When he was a few feet away, Noah's eyes met his. The young boy looked at him with a mix of hope and wariness. Ethan stopped in his tracks, not knowing what to say, but before he could speak, Sophia stepped forward, her eyes wide, her expression softer than before. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a mix of sadness and something else, maybe hope. "Are you really here to stay?" Ethan nodded, swallowing hard as he tried to find the right words. "I'm here to stay," he said, his voice firm, though his heart was still heavy with doubt. "I'm not going anywhere. I've learned from my mistakes, and I'm going to prove it." Sophia's gaze softened, and she turned to Noah. The two children exchanged a look, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of trust in their eyes. It was a small moment, but it was enough to give him hope. As Ethan stood there, watching them, he knew the road ahead would be long. He didn't know if he could ever undo the pain he had caused, but he was ready to try. For them, for Maria, for himself. Ethan stood outside the small community center, the crisp autumn air biting at his skin. It wasn't the cold that made him feel chilled, but the weight of the moment. The tension was almost unbearable as he stood there, taking in the sight of the building that held the key to his future. He had come a long way, months of self-reflection, public apologies, and quiet acts of contrition. And now, it all came down to this. Maria had agreed to meet him here, to talk. She had agreed to give him a chance. But now, more than ever, Ethan knew that it was no longer just about him. As he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of coffee and the low murmur of conversation filled the air. The community center was modest but warm, with old wooden floors and simple chairs scattered around. The room was mostly empty, save for a few scattered individuals, but there, at the far end, sat Maria. Her back was straight, her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her eyes, when they met his, were unreadable. It felt as if the years of distance between them had condensed into that single look. She was waiting, and so was he. But for what, the answer was uncertain, just as much a mystery to him as it was to her. Ethan's breath caught as he approached her. The weight in his chest grew heavier with every step. He had hoped no. He had prayed that the work he had put in would be enough. But now, as he stood before her, he knew this was the moment that would define everything. It wasn't about words anymore. It was about proving himself, not just to her, but to Noah and Sophia, and, most importantly, to himself. Maria did not smile, nor did she offer any signs of encouragement. She simply sat there, her gaze steady and unwavering, waiting for him to speak. "I came," Ethan said, the first words between them after so much silence. "I'm here." Maria nodded slightly, her eyes scanning his face, as though searching for something, for truth, for sincerity. But before he could continue, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I've been waiting for you to show up," she said. The words felt like a statement of fact, but there was something in her voice, something that hinted at more. "But now, I need to know, what are you really willing to do?" "Ethan, what are you going to do for Noah and Sophia?" The question hit him like a punch. He had come here prepared for many things, but not this. He had thought he could simply apologize, lay out his feelings, and everything would fall into place. But Maria wasn't asking for apologies anymore. She was asking for action, for proof, and not just from him, but for the children, for the family he had failed so badly. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. His mind raced, searching for the right words, the right response. But there was only one thing that felt true, only one thing that mattered. "I'm not asking for a perfect future, Maria," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I'm asking for a chance to build something real, together, with you and the kids. It's not just about me proving myself to you, it's about us creating something new, step by step, together." For a moment, there was silence between them. The only sound was the faint rustling of papers on the table, the clock ticking softly in the background. Maria's gaze softened, and Ethan thought he saw something crack in her expression. Just a hint of the woman he had once known, the woman he had fallen in love with, but it was fleeting. The wall she had built between them remained strong, and Ethan knew that breaking it down would take more than words. It would take actions, real, consistent actions over time. "I don't want promises," Maria said, her voice steady, her eyes still searching his. "I want actions. I need to see that you're in this for the long haul." Her words cut through him, sharper than any critique he had received. It was the truth, raw and unfiltered. Ethan had always believed that love could heal anything. But love, it seemed, wasn't enough. Not anymore. Not when there were years of mistakes, of silence, of broken promises between them. "I am," Ethan replied, his voice low, filled with the weight of everything he had come to understand over these past months. "I am, Maria." The words lingered in the air, hanging there like a promise. But Maria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, her face still guarded. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her. He wasn't sure if she had heard him, if she believed him, or if this was just another conversation that would end without resolution. Maria turned her back on him and walked toward the door. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew that this could be it, that this could be the moment that would decide everything. He had fought for so long, tried so hard, but he wasn't sure if it would ever be enough. As she reached the door, Maria paused. For a moment, her back was to him, and the silence stretched on. Then, without turning around, she spoke again. "I never wanted you to leave." "Ethan," Maria said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "But I had no choice. We both did what we thought was best." The words were like a knife to his chest, but he understood them. She had acted out of fear of being abandoned again, fear of hurting the children more than she already had. He had never fully understood her actions, her reasons, but now, in this moment, he could see them more clearly. They had both made choices. Both had tried to protect each other in their own ways, but in doing so, they had only driven themselves further apart. Maria opened the door, the cool breeze from outside slipping in. She hesitated for just a moment, her hand still on the knob, her head bowed. "I don't know if I can trust you again," Maria whispered, her voice breaking, "but I'm willing to try. For them, for Noah and Sophia, and maybe for us." And with that, she stepped out into the night, leaving Ethan standing in the empty room, his heart heavy, but his resolve firm. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to give up. He would fight for Maria, for the twins, and for the family they could still have. The days following Ethan's public apology were a blur. It felt like every step he took was met with resistance. The weight of the past still clung to him, and no matter how hard he tried to prove his sincerity, it seemed that every move he made only added to the growing narrative of his failure. Every phone call, every meeting, every public statement, everything felt scrutinized, as if the world was watching him stumble. Rebecca's campaign against him had taken on a new life of its own. She had positioned herself as the voice of reason, the one who had been wronged, the one who was protecting the children from the chaos that Ethan had brought into their lives. The media, ever eager for a story, had latched onto the drama like vultures circling above, eager for any scrap of scandal to chew on. The headlines, the news segments, the online discussions. It all painted a picture of Ethan as a man who had abandoned his family and was now trying to redeem himself with empty gestures. No one seemed to understand that what he truly wanted wasn't redemption. It was simply the chance to rebuild, to create something new from the ruins he had left behind. As the days wore on, Ethan found himself questioning whether it was all worth it. The pressure was becoming unbearable. The smearing from Rebecca, the harsh words from the media, the whispers behind his back, it was enough to make him want to retreat, to walk away and let things be. But he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he had sacrificed to get this far. He had already lost so much, but he wasn't ready to lose Maria and the twins, too. He had tried everything, showing up at Maria's work, spending time with the children, being there when she needed him. But despite his efforts, Maria seemed distant. The coldness that had once defined their relationship seemed to have taken hold again, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it was slipping through his fingers. The small steps he had made didn't feel like enough. They weren't enough for Maria, and they weren't enough for the people who had once believed in him. One evening, he found himself sitting across from his family at dinner, the conversation going nowhere. His mother asked the usual questions, his father spoke in clipped sentences, and his sister offered him sympathetic glances. But Ethan was lost in his thoughts. The table felt so much emptier now, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. As he sat there, the ringing of his phone shattered the quiet. He glanced at the screen and saw Rebecca's name flashing across it. His stomach tightened. He didn't want to take the call, but he knew he had no choice. Ethan. Rebecca's voice crackled through the line, her tone sharp and biting. "I'm warning you, Ethan. You're not going to win this fight. You never should have come back." Her words hit him like a slap. The venom in her voice, the accusations, he could feel it all burning through him. His heart raced, the anger boiling just below the surface. But more than that, there was a crushing weight in his chest, a feeling that no matter what he did, it would never be enough. He would never be able to undo the past, no matter how hard he tried. "I'm not doing this for you," Ethan finally said, his voice trembling with the effort to keep his emotions in check. "I'm doing this for Maria, for the kids, for myself. I've made my mistakes, but I'm not going to let you make me believe that I can't change." Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "Change. You can't change the fact that you walked away. You can't change the fact that you ruined everything." The words stung, but Ethan wasn't about to let her tear him down. He had spent too long letting her define his actions, too long letting her control the narrative of his life. But now, for the first time in years, He was taking control. He wasn't going to let her or anyone tell him who he was or what he could do. He hung up the phone, the silence in the room settling heavily over him. His family continued to eat, as if nothing had changed, but Ethan's mind was racing. The conversation with Rebecca had ignited something inside of him. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't hide anymore. He couldn't run from the consequences of his past. The phone call had been a wake-up call. He had to face the people he had hurt. He had to face the public, the media, and, most importantly, himself. It wasn't enough to just apologize. He needed to show Maria and the world that he was ready to fight, ready to prove that he wasn't the man they all thought he was. As he stood up from the dinner table, he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he was certain of one thing. He wasn't going to let Rebecca's words define him any longer. He wasn't going to let his mistakes keep him from having a future with Maria and the twins. He left the house and drove to the community center. The familiar lights illuminated the building, but tonight it felt different. This wasn't just another meeting. It was his last chance. Maria had agreed to meet him, but there was something in her voice the last time they spoke that made him wonder if this would be the end. He walked up to the door, his heart pounding. This was the moment of truth. He had nothing left to lose. As he entered the center, the smell of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air. Maria was sitting in the back corner, her face a mixture of uncertainty and something more, something that made Ethan's chest tighten. She looked up as he entered, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, the years of hurt, the anger, the distance, everything seemed to fall away. Maria stood up, her expression unreadable. "I've been waiting for you to show up, but now, I need to know, what are you really willing to do? Ethan, what are you going to do for Noah and Sophia?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had been prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, he realized he was more afraid than he had ever been. "I'm not asking for a perfect future, Maria," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm asking for a chance to build something real, together, with you and the kids. It's not just about me proving myself. It's about us creating something new, step by step, together." For a moment, Maria was silent, her eyes locked on his. Then, slowly, she spoke. "I don't want promises," she said. "I want actions. I need to see that you're in this for the long haul." Ethan nodded, his voice resolute. I'm here, for all of us." Maria's eyes softened, but there was still doubt in them. She looked at him for a long moment before turning away. "I'll need to see it, Ethan," she said quietly. "And I'll need time. But I'm willing to give you a chance. For them." As she walked away, Ethan stood there, feeling a sense of relief and fear wash over him. He had taken the first step. The path ahead would be long and uncertain, but it was a path he was willing to walk no matter the cost. Ethan had never felt so exhausted, nor so deeply uncertain. Every inch of his path forward had felt like a battle, and with each step, he took toward reconciliation with Maria and the twins. There seemed to be 2 steps backward waiting to drag him down. The weight of his past mistakes, the ghosts of his decisions, loomed large over him. There were days when he felt like he was drowning in regret and failure, questioning whether the man he was now was enough to right all the wrongs he had done. The pressure from the outside world was relentless. Rebecca's smear campaign had reached new heights. Her accusations continued to circulate, the media feasting on every morsel of gossip she provided. He was painted as a man desperately trying to reclaim what he had thrown away, as if his actions over the years could be wiped away with a few heartfelt apologies and public gestures. The world didn't understand. Ethan didn't need redemption for the sake of his reputation. He needed redemption because he had failed the people he loved most. He had spent countless nights reflecting on his past, sifting through the rubble of his life to understand how he had gotten to this point. And one evening, after hours of wrestling with his own demons, something finally clicked for Ethan. Redemption wasn't about clearing his name in the eyes of the world. It wasn't about winning back his image or repairing his reputation. Redemption was about becoming the person he needed to be for Maria and the twins. It was about looking them in the eyes, with sincerity, and proving that he was ready to do whatever it took to rebuild the life they deserved. For the first time in weeks, Ethan found peace within himself. He realized that he could no longer care about the headlines or the opinions of strangers. What mattered now, more than anything, was showing up for the people who mattered most to him: Maria, Noah, and Sophia. They deserved more than his apologies. They deserved his commitment. It was with this new sense of purpose that Ethan reached out to Maria. He arranged to meet her at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a place where the prying eyes of the press and the weight of public opinion wouldn't follow them. When he arrived, he saw her sitting at a corner table, her eyes focused on the cup in front of her, her face unreadable. Ethan took a deep breath and walked toward her. The space between them was still thick with unspoken words, unresolved pain, and the remnants of their fractured past. He sat down across from her, the air between them heavy with history. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maria's eyes flickered up to meet his, then quickly dropped again, as if she were still unsure of what to say, or even if she should say anything at all. Ethan could feel the distance between them, the chasm that had once been filled with love, but now seemed impossibly wide. Finally, Maria broke the silence. Her voice was steady, but the rawness in it was unmistakable. "I've been waiting for you to show up, but now, I need to know, what are you really willing to do? Ethan, what are you going to do for Noah and Sophia?" Ethan's heart clenched in his chest. He had prepared for this moment, but hearing the question spoken aloud made it all the more real. The future he had hoped for, the future that felt so close, was still out of his reach. He looked into Maria's eyes, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm not asking for a perfect future, Maria. I'm asking for a chance to build something real. Together. With you and the kids. It's not just about me proving myself. It's about us creating something new, step by step. Together." Maria's eyes softened for a brief moment. He could see the wall she had built between them begin to crack, just a little, as she considered his words. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't a promise of a happy ending, but it was a step forward, and that was more than he could have hoped for. "I don't want promises," Maria said, her voice quieter now, the hardness in it fading. "I want actions. I need to see that you're in this for the long haul." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for forgiveness. He was fighting for something deeper. He was fighting for a chance to be the man Maria needed him to be. "I am," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "I'm here. For all of us." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of their conversation hanging in the air. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they began to shift the conversation. It was no longer about the past. It wasn't about the mistakes that had been made or the pain that had been caused. Instead, they talked about the future, about what they could build together. Maria's hand brushed against Ethan's as they spoke, a quiet, tentative gesture. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness yet, but it was a step forward, and for the first time in what felt like forever. Ethan allowed himself to hope. But just as they began to talk about the next steps, the conversation was interrupted by the harsh tone of Ethan's phone buzzing. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of his lawyer flashing. He excused himself and answered the call, but as he listened to the voice on the other end, his heart sank. There was news regarding the custody battle, and it wasn't good. Ethan quickly hung up the phone, his eyes scanning Maria's face. Her expression had shifted. The warmth that had just begun to grow between them quickly replaced with a flicker of concern. The moment of peace they had found was slipping away, and the weight of the reality they were living in crashed down on them both. Maria stood abruptly, her eyes darkening. "We'll talk about this later," she said, her voice strained. "But right now, I need some space to think." Ethan stood too, his heart racing. He hadn't expected the conversation to go this way, but he knew that the road ahead would be more difficult than he had imagined. He had started to believe that they were finally moving forward, but it seemed that the world had other plans. The custody battle, the past mistakes, the looming pressure of Rebecca's accusations, it was all coming to a head. As Maria walked away, Ethan stood there, watching her go, feeling the familiar weight of doubt creep back into his chest. He had made progress, but it was clear that the journey was far from over. There was still so much to prove. He wasn't ready to give up, though. Not now. Not when he had come this far. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was willing to walk it. The question was, would Maria be willing to walk it with him? The courtroom was packed, its air thick with tension, as Ethan sat nervously in the defendant's chair. The walls seemed to close in on him, the weight of the accusations and the burden of his past hanging over him like a storm cloud. This wasn't how he had imagined this moment would feel. The truth, no matter how many times he had rehearsed his defense in his mind, was harder to face in reality than he had anticipated. The courtroom wasn't just a place where his life had been turned upside down. It felt like the final judgment on everything he had ever done, a place where every mistake was laid bare for the world to see. But even through the crushing pressure, there was one glimmer of light in the room, Maria. Ethan's heart raced as he watched her, the woman who had once been his everything, sitting in the witness box, her expression unwavering. The years of pain between them had created a rift so deep, it seemed impossible to repair. Yet here she was, standing tall, confronting the past that had torn them apart. For a moment, Ethan was struck by the realization that this wasn't about winning or losing. He had come into this battle thinking it was a fight for custody of the twins, for his redemption. But now he understood that it was something far more important. It was about seeing each other, truly seeing each other for the first time in years. It was about understanding the pain they had both endured, the mistakes they had both made, and the love that had never completely disappeared, buried beneath the weight of regret. Maria's testimony began with a quiet strength. She spoke about the pain of losing everything her father's business, her trust in him, and the life they had planned together. She spoke of the broken promises and the weight of raising Noah and Sophia on her own, the daily struggles that no one had seen, and the choices she had made in the name of protecting her children. Ethan listened intently, each word from her cutting deeper into him, but not in the way he had expected. Her words were not filled with the bitterness he feared. Instead, they were filled with the raw, unhealed wounds of a woman who had loved him and then lost him. When she finally spoke of their shared history, the love they had once shared, Ethan felt his chest tighten. He hadn't realized how much he had been yearning to hear those words. The courtroom, the accusations, the pain, it all seemed to melt away in that moment as he heard Maria speak not only of the hurt, but also of the love they had once had. It was as if she had opened a door to the past, one that Ethan had been too afraid to open for fear of what he might find. And then, without warning, the tears came. He had held them in for so long, hiding behind his stoic exterior, trying to convince himself that he was above the pain. But in this moment, as Maria's words echoed in his heart, he couldn't hold back anymore. The tears streamed down his face, but he didn't hide them. He didn't care. This was the raw truth, the truth he had needed to confront for so long. His own heartache, his mistakes, the people he had failed it was all laid bare, and for the first time, he felt the weight of it all. The room was silent, but the silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. It was a quiet acknowledgement that they had both been through so much, that the wounds they carried were not just their own, but shared. And in that shared silence, something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward understanding, toward healing. When the judge returned with his ruling, Ethan held his breath. The verdict would determine not just the future of his relationship with Maria, but the future of his relationship with Noah and Sophia, the children he had longed to be a part of. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the world hanging in the balance. When the judge spoke, the words were not the ones Ethan had expected. They were not words of victory or defeat, but words that held a deeper truth. They would share custody of Noah and Sophia. The judge emphasized the importance of collaboration, of working together for the sake of the children's well-being. It wasn't the grand victory Ethan had hoped for, but it was something better. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that they would write together, step by step. As the courtroom emptied, Maria and Ethan found themselves standing side by side outside the courthouse. The weight of the ruling settled in, but it wasn't the weight of defeat. It was the weight of a shared responsibility, a commitment to work together to rebuild what had been broken. They walked down the steps together, the cool wind of the late afternoon brushing against their faces. For the first time in a long time, there was no barrier between them, no walls built by fear or anger. It was just the two of them, facing forward, knowing that the future was uncertain, but also knowing that they had the chance to rebuild. Maria's hand brushed against Ethan's as they walked, the touch light but meaningful. It wasn't an embrace of forgiveness, not yet, but it was a gesture of something far more important: trust. "I'm sorry for everything," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with the weight of everything he had just confessed. "For all the mistakes I've made." Maria didn't say anything for a long time, but when she did, her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "We can't change the past, Ethan, but we can build a future. We can choose to do better, every day." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He knew that their journey was far from over, but in that moment, he finally understood what it meant to fight for something that mattered. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about showing up, about being present, about doing the work, even when it was hard, even when it seemed impossible. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of the day still hanging over them, but also the possibility of something new, something real. They weren't perfect, they weren't fixed, but they were willing to try. And sometimes, that's all you need to move forward. As they reached the end of the steps, Ethan took Maria's hand in his. "I'm here to stay," he said quietly. "I'll prove it to you. Every day." Maria glanced at him, her eyes softening. "We'll see, Ethan. We'll see." And for the first time, Ethan felt like he had a chance, not just at redemption, but at a real, honest future, a future built on trust, respect, and love. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. As the sun set, casting its soft glow over the quiet park, he stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the world move on around him. It wasn't about the grand gestures or the loud declarations anymore. It was in the moments of silence, the ones where no one spoke, but everything was understood. Sometimes, change isn't loud, it's soft. It's the quiet things we do, day after day, that speak the loudest. The road ahead wasn't clear, nor was it easy, but in the space between the words, there was something unspoken, a promise. Perhaps, maybe that's all we need, not to know how it ends, but to trust that, somehow, we're still moving forward. And in the stillness of that thought, the air felt just a little lighter. Could we ever really know what tomorrow will bring, or do we only find it in the steps we take today?